3 a.m. 1967. Bumpy Johnson stood in front of a Manhattan precinct, gripping a shackled 8-year-old white girl he'd just ripped from Frank Lucas's basement, while 47 NYPD guns locked onto his skull. She wasn't screaming. She was protecting him. The last time Harlem saw Bumpy, this silent 3 men died before sunrise. So why did the king of Harlem risk a death sentence to rescue a federal judge's daughter? And what did Frank do that even the underworld considered unforgivable September 14, 1967? Harlem stopped breathing, and nobody knew why. For 72 hours straight, 125th Street looked like a ghost town wearing expensive clothes. The Cadillacs that usually rolled through at 15 miles per hour with chrome so polished you could see your reflection 3 blocks away stayed parked. The corners where young men stood in groups of 4 or 5, laughing too loud and counting money they did not earn legally sat empty as a church on Tuesday morning. The barbershops that normally hummed with gossip about who got rich, who got arrested, who got buried closed their doors at 6 p.m. instead of staying open until the last customer stumbled home drunk. This was not normal. This was not how power operated in Harlem. When you controlled territory, you showed it. You drove the cars. You wore the suits. You stood on the corners, reminding everyone who ran the block and what happened when someone forgot. Silence meant weakness. Silence meant the law was coming. Silence meant bodies were about to drop, and nobody wanted to be standing in the wrong place when the shooting started. But this silence felt different. It felt controlled, deliberate, like someone had turned down the volume on an entire neighborhood, and everybody understood the assignment without being told. The numbers runners who usually worked Lenox Avenue collecting nickels and dimes from housewives betting on their grandmother's birthday stayed home. The bartenders at Small's Paradise served drinks without the usual backroom poker games running until sunrise. Even the prostitutes working 8th Avenue knocked off early, walking home in groups instead of standing under streetlights waiting for cars to slow down. Frank Lucas had vanished completely. Nobody had seen him in 3 days. His usual table at Red Rooster sat empty. His powder blue Lincoln Continental with the white leather interior stayed parked outside his townhouse on West 138th Street, covered in a thin layer of September dust. His crew, the men who moved product from the Bronx to Brooklyn and took a cut off every transaction, scattered like roaches when the kitchen light flips on. Some went to stay with family in New Jersey. Others drove to Philadelphia. A few just stopped answering their phones and hoped whatever storm was coming would blow past them. The rumors started small and grew like mold in a damp basement. The feds were coming. Grand jury indictments, RICO charges, wiretaps, witnesses flipping. Someone said they saw unmarked FBI cars circling the block at 2 a.m., but nobody could confirm it. Someone else swore Frank was cooperating, cutting a deal to save his own neck while throwing everyone else under the bus. But if the feds were really coming, where were the raids? Where were the arrests? Where were the cops kicking down doors at dawn with battering rams and search warrants? Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue with the curtains drawn, smoking Pall Malls and watching the street below. He was 62 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades settling disputes with violence when words stopped working. His hands were scarred across the knuckles from breaking jaws that talked too much. His eyes were the color of bourbon poured over ice, sharp enough to count the buttons on your shirt from across the room, and cold enough to make you check your back for knives. Bumpy did not fear the police. He had survived 5 arrests, 3 trials, 2 prison sentences, and more beatings from cops than he bothered counting. The police were predictable. They wanted money or headlines, and you could negotiate with both. What Bumpy feared was the silence. What he feared was the power vacuum. What he feared was what happens when a man like Frank Lucas disappears without explanation and leaves 50,000 people wondering who fills the empty space he left behind. In the underworld, uncertainty killed faster than bullets. When nobody knew who was in charge, everybody started testing boundaries. Old debts got ignored. Old grudges got settled. Territory that took years to claim got carved up in a weekend by whoever had the guns and the nerve to take it. And when the shooting started, innocent people died. Grandmothers got hit by stray bullets. Kids playing on stoops caught rounds meant for someone else. Harlem turned into a war zone, and war zones attracted federal attention that made everyone's life worse. So Bumpy watched and waited, because that is what you do when you have lived long enough to understand that patience kills more enemies than rage ever could. The files would later describe this period as pre-enforcement instability, which was government language for the chaos that happens right before the hammer drops. But Bumpy knew better. This was not instability. This was control. Someone had made Harlem go quiet, and quiet meant they were powerful enough that people obeyed without being asked. Real power does not announce itself. Real power makes the streets regulate themselves, and whoever had that kind of power right now was not the police. September 17, 1967. Bumpy Johnson stood outside Frank Lucas's townhouse at 9:45 p.m., studying a building that should not be this dark. The townhouse sat on West 138th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue, a 4-story brownstone with marble steps and iron railings painted glossy black. Frank bought it in 1965 for $80,000 cash, then spent another $40,000 remodeling the interior with Italian tile crystal chandeliers and a kitchen big enough to cook for 20 people. The man loved showing off. He threw parties that ran until sunrise with champagne flowing and women who looked like they walked off magazine covers. His living room had a white grand piano. Nobody knew how to play, but everybody admired. Tonight, every window was black. Curtains drawn tight. No lights bleeding through the fabric. No music, no voices, no movement. Bumpy walked up the steps slowly, his shoes making soft clicks against the marble. The front door was unlocked, which was the first wrong detail. Frank was paranoid about security. He had 2 deadbolts, a chain lock, and usually kept at least one man stationed inside with a shotgun. Leaving the door unlocked was like leaving your wallet on a subway bench and hoping nobody noticed. Inside, the air smelled wrong. Perfume, the expensive kind that came in bottles shaped like sculptures, hung heavy enough to taste. Underneath that, something sharper. Sweat, fear. The smell a room gets when someone has been sitting in the dark for hours, too scared to turn on a light, waiting for footsteps that never came. The living room looked like someone left in a hurry, but tried to pretend they did not. A plate of food sat on the coffee table, steak cut into pieces, but only half-eaten mashed potatoes going cold and hard. A glass of Scotch ice melted down to slivers. Cigarettes stubbed out in a crystal ashtray, still smelling faintly of tobacco. The white piano sat untouched, sheet music open to a song nobody finished playing. Bumpy moved through the house like a ghost, stepping carefully, touching nothing. In the bedroom upstairs, dresser drawers hung open and empty. The closet that usually held 20 custom suits showed nothing but wire hangers swinging slightly, like someone had grabbed armfuls of clothes and run. The bathroom counter was clear, except for a bottle of cologne knocked on its side, liquid pooled around the base and dripping onto the tile. But here is what stopped Bumpy cold. The master bedroom had hardwood floors, polished to a mirror shine, the kind of floors that cost $5 a square foot to install. Underneath the perfume and fear, underneath the cologne and tobacco, there was another smell. Damp earth. Mildew. The smell of a basement that does not get enough air, of concrete that stays wet, of spaces underground, where things rot slowly. You do not get that smell in a house like this. You do not get that smell unless something is very wrong in a place most people never see. Bumpy stood in the center of the bedroom listening. The house was silent, but silence has texture. This was not the silence of an empty building. This was the silence of a building holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. He could have called the police. Anonymous tip. Let them tear the place apart with search warrants and probable cause. But that would have started a chain reaction Bumpy could not control. Cops asking questions, reporters writing stories, federal agents getting interested. And once the feds started digging, they did not stop until everybody involved was either in prison or dead. Bumpy made his decision the way he always did. Slowly, carefully, with the understanding that every choice carried weight, and some weights crushed you if you picked them up wrong. He would not call the police. He would not leave fingerprints. He would handle this the way Harlem handled problems before badges and courts got involved. He walked back downstairs, stepping over the same spots he stepped over, coming in moving through the kitchen toward the back of the house. There was a door he had not opened yet. A door that led down. The official record would never mention a search warrant for this address. No judge signed off on entering Frank Lucas's home. No detective filed a report. Because some things happen in the space between legal and illegal where men like Bumpy Johnson operate according to rules that do not get written in courtrooms. A man running from the law is not afraid of prison. He is afraid of being seen too clearly. He is afraid someone will look close enough to notice what he has been hiding. And whatever Frank Lucas was hiding, it smelled like damp earth in a house that should smell like money and power. Bumpy reached for the basement door and turned the handle. The door to Frank Lucas's basement opened with a sound like bone cracking, not the smooth click of a well-oiled hinge, not the whisper of wood sliding against wood in a house where everything cost too much to squeak. This was the rough scrape of a lock installed badly and in a hurry by someone who did not care if it looked right, only that it held. The metal was new, bright silver against old wood still showing file marks where someone ground down the edges to make it fit. Bumpy stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into darkness that felt thicker than it should. The smell hit him immediately. Mildew, yes. Damp concrete, yes. But underneath that, something else. Something animal and human at the same time. The smell of fear so sharp it soaks into walls and stays there, the smell of a body that has not seen sunlight or soap or clean air in days. He found the light switch and flipped it. A single bulb hanging from a wire cord flickered twice, then held throwing weak yellow light across a basement that looked like a construction site abandoned halfway through. The floor was bare concrete, cracked in places, stained dark in others. The walls were exposed brick sweating moisture that ran down in thin lines and pooled in the corners. There were no windows, no furniture, no boxes of old belongings or storage shelves holding paint cans and Christmas decorations like you find in normal basements. There was a steel pipe running floor to ceiling in the center of the room, part of the building's plumbing. And chained to that pipe, with a length of hardware store chain and a padlock, was a little white girl. She looked about 8 years old, maybe 9. Blonde hair matted and dirty hanging in her face, wearing a dress that might have been pink once but was now the color of old dishwater torn at the hem, stained with things Bumpy did not want to identify. Her wrists were raw where the chain rubbed against skin, red and starting to bleed in places. Her feet were bare, filthy toenails cracked. She was shaking. Not crying. Not screaming. Just shaking like a dog left out in winter, her whole body vibrating with cold or terror or both. Her eyes were huge blue as summer sky locked on Bumpy's face, with the kind of intensity that comes from spending days in darkness, learning to identify threats by the sound of footsteps on stairs. Bumpy did not move for 5 full seconds, did not speak, did not reach for the chain. He stood there absorbing what he was seeing, his brain catching up to his eyes, his understanding of Frank Lucas rewriting itself in real time. In the underworld, there were rules, not laws. Laws were for people who believed the system worked. But rules, yes, rules that kept society from collapsing completely into blood and chaos. You did not sell to kids. You did not hurt civilians who were not in the game. You did not bring heat down on the neighborhood by doing things so ugly that even cops who took bribes could not look the other way. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, ever put your hands on a child. Children were off limits. Children were the line you did not cross because crossing it meant you were no longer human, no longer part of the community, no longer protected by the same rules that kept everyone else alive. You touched a child. You became something else. Something that needed to be removed from the world with extreme prejudice and no mercy. Bumpy's face did not change, did not twist with rage, did not harden with disgust. It went completely blank smooth, as a frozen lake in January, empty of everything, except the cold mathematical certainty that Frank Lucas had just signed his own death warrant. He did not shout, did not curse, did not kick the walls or punch the pipe or make any of the violent gestures that usually came when Bumpy Johnson saw something that needed destroying. Instead, he moved slowly toward the girl, his hands visible, his voice low and steady. "I am going to get you out of here," he said. "I am not going to hurt you. Do you understand?" The girl did not answer, just kept shaking, kept staring, kept breathing in short, rapid gasps that sounded like she was drowning on dry land. Bumpy pulled a set of lockpicks from his jacket pocket tools he had carried since he was 15, and learned that locks were suggestions, not barriers. The padlock was cheap, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $6 to secure a storage unit or bike. It took him 11 seconds to pop it open. The chain fell away. The girl did not run, did not move. Just stood there, swaying slightly like she had forgotten what it felt like to be unchained, and her body needed time to remember how freedom worked. Bumpy took off his jacket, a charcoal gray wool blazer that cost $200 and fit him like it was painted on, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It hung on her like a tent dragging on the concrete floor, but it was warm and clean, and smelled like cigarette smoke instead of fear. "What is your name?" he asked. The girl's mouth moved. No sound came out at first, then barely a whisper. "Emily." "Okay, Emily," Bumpy said. "We are leaving now. You are going to walk up those stairs with me, and then we are going somewhere safe. Do you understand?" She nodded once. Small movement, barely there. Bumpy stood, offered his hand. Emily looked at it for a long moment, like she was calculating whether trust was something she could afford. Then her small, dirty fingers wrapped around his, and they walked up the basement stairs together. Behind them, the light bulb flickered once and went out, leaving the basement dark again. But the smell stayed. The smell would stay in that house for years, soaked into the walls, a permanent reminder that some sins do not wash away. You do not need to kill someone to commit a crime that destroys you. You just need to chain the wrong person to a pipe in your basement and wait for someone like Bumpy Johnson to find them. Bumpy Johnson sat in his Buick Electra, parked 3 blocks from Frank Lucas's townhouse, with Emily wrapped in his jacket in the passenger seat, and asked the question he should have asked in the basement. "Emily, what?" The girl's voice came out small and hoarse, like she had been screaming for days, and her throat finally gave up. "Harrison." The name hit Bumpy like a fist to the solar plexus. Harrison, not Smith, not Jones, not Williams or Brown or any of the 10,000 anonymous last names that would have made this a tragedy instead of a catastrophe. Harrison meant one thing in New York in 1967. It meant Judge Theodore Harrison, appointed to the federal district court 3 years ago by President Johnson himself. The man who sentenced mob bosses to 20-year stretches in Leavenworth. The man who signed RICO warrants that dismantled entire crime families. The man who could not be bought, could not be threatened, could not be scared into looking the other way. And Frank Lucas had kidnapped his daughter. Bumpy's hands tightened on the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles went white. He stared through the windshield at nothing, his brain running calculations faster than it had moved in years. This was not some random snatch for ransom money. This was not a junkie making bad decisions or a desperate man trying to settle a debt. This was leverage. This was Frank Lucas trying to play politics with a federal judge using an 8-year-old girl as the bargaining chip. Which meant Frank was either a genius or the stupidest man who ever walked the earth, and Bumpy was betting heavily on stupid. If Emily Harrison turned up dead, every federal agent within 200 miles would descend on Harlem like locusts on a wheat field. They would kick down every door, shake down every corner boy, arrest every numbers runner, and burn the entire neighborhood to the ground, looking for whoever killed a federal judge's daughter. It would not matter if Frank did it. It would not matter if Bumpy had nothing to do with it. Harlem would pay the price because Harlem was where the crime happened. And when white children die in black neighborhoods, justice stops caring about details like guilt or innocence. But if Emily Harrison turned up alive, the outcome was almost worse. Because now, there were questions. How did she end up in Frank Lucas's basement? Who knew about it? Who helped? Who kept quiet? And the feds would tear through Harlem, asking those questions, with subpoenas and grand juries and wiretaps, until every business owner, every bartender, every grandmother who ran numbers out of her kitchen was either cooperating or going to prison. Frank Lucas had planted a bomb under the entire community and set the timer ticking. Whether Emily lived or died, Harlem was about to burn. The only question was how many people would still be standing when the smoke cleared. Bumpy looked at the girl sitting next to him, shaking inside a jacket 3 sizes too big, staring at her hands like she was trying to remember what they looked like before the chains. She was not leverage. She was not a bargaining chip. She was a child who had spent days in a basement because a man decided his freedom was worth more than her life. And that man had just signed a death warrant for 50,000 people who never asked to be involved in his war with the federal government. There was no precedent for this. In 40 years of running Harlem's underworld, Bumpy had seen men killed over territory disputes, over stolen product, over disrespect and debts and women. He had seen violence that would make civilians vomit and cops quit their jobs. But he had never seen someone weaponize a child against the entire community. Never seen someone so selfish, so short-sighted, so fundamentally broken that they would risk destroying everything and everyone around them just to buy themselves a little more time. Frank Lucas was not a criminal. He was a disease, and diseases had to be cut out before they spread. Bumpy started the engine, the V8 rumbling to life like a sleeping animal waking up angry. He pulled away from the curb, slowly driving east toward the precinct on 126th Street. Emily did not ask where they were going, just sat there, gripping the edges of his jacket, breathing in shallow gasps, staring at the streetlights passing overhead. "You are going home tonight," Bumpy said quietly. "I promise you that." The girl turned her head to look at him, her blue eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. "My daddy is going to be mad." "Your daddy is going to be grateful you are alive," Bumpy said. "The rest we will figure out later." But he knew the truth. Judge Theodore Harrison was going to want blood. He was going to want arrests and convictions and long prison sentences for everyone involved. And when powerful white men want blood, they do not stop at the guilty. They take everyone within reach and sort it out later. One mistake, one selfish decision by one man and an entire community was about to pay a price they never agreed to. That was the math of power. That was the cost of living in a neighborhood where the law only showed up to make arrests, never to offer protection. Bumpy drove through Harlem at 25 miles per hour, watching his city pass by the windows. The barbershops that would get raided. The bars that would get shut down. The families that would get torn apart when fathers and brothers and sons went to prison for crimes they did not commit just because they lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. Frank Lucas had not just kidnapped a child. He had taken a loaded gun, pointed it at Harlem's head, and pulled the trigger. Whether the bullet killed them all or just left them bleeding depended entirely on what Bumpy did in the next 12 hours. And for the first time in 40 years, Bumpy Johnson was not sure he could fix this. September 18th, 1967. Bumpy Johnson found Frank Lucas hiding in a motel room in Yonkers at 11:30 a.m. and made the decision not to kill him immediately. The Starlight Motor Lodge sat on Central Avenue, a two-story brick building with peeling paint and a neon sign missing half its letters. $30 a night cash only, no questions asked. The kind of place where married men brought women who were not their wives, where fugitives slept with shoes on in case they needed to run, where the mattresses smelled like cigarette smoke and regret. Frank was in room 214, second floor, corner unit. Bumpy knew this because he had 17 men scattered across Harlem, whose only job was to watch, listen, and report back when something important moved. One of them saw Frank's powder blue Lincoln parked behind a liquor store in the Bronx. Another saw Frank buying cigarettes at a bodega in Mount Vernon wearing sunglasses at night. A third tracked him to this motel and called Bumpy from a payphone 6 blocks away. Bumpy drove up alone. No backup, no crew, no guns. This confused the 3 men he brought with him, hardened enforcers who had spent the last decade breaking bones for money and expected this to be a murder, not a conversation. Bumpy left them in the car with the engine running and walked up the exterior stairs to the second floor by himself, hands empty, face calm, as Sunday morning. He knocked on the door of room 214 3 times. Solid knocks, not aggressive, not timid. The knocks of a man who knows you are inside and knows you are not brave enough to ignore him. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain lock. Frank Lucas looked through the gap with eyes that had not seen sleep in 3 days. Unshaven, shirt wrinkled, smelling like fear mixed with expensive cologne that could not quite cover it up. "Bumpy," Frank's voice cracked halfway through the name. "I can explain." "Open the door," Bumpy said. Not loud, not angry, just factual, like he was reading a grocery list. Frank hesitated, his fingers twitching on the chain lock, calculating whether keeping the door closed bought him anything except 30 more seconds of breathing. Then the chain slid free, and the door opened, and Bumpy Johnson walked into the room like he owned it, which in every way that mattered, he did. The room looked like what happens when panic meets money. There were 2 suitcases open on the bedclothes spilling out, stacks of cash on the nightstand, 20s and 50s and hundreds rubber-banded into bricks. A half-empty bottle of Johnny Walker Black sitting next to a glass with melted ice. The television was on, but muted, showing a game show where people guessed prices and won refrigerators. Bumpy closed the door behind him, looked at Frank, waited. It was not supposed to go like this. Frank started, his words coming fast and desperate. It was just insurance, just a way to make sure Harrison backed off the... Bumpy's hand came up faster than Frank could process and connected with the side of his face hard enough to snap his head sideways and send him stumbling into the nightstand. Not a punch. A slap. Open palm. The sound echoed in the small room like a gunshot, sharp and clean and final. Frank caught himself on the edge of the bed, one hand going to his cheek where a red handprint was already blooming. He stared at Bumpy with wide eyes, waiting for the next blow, waiting for the gun to come out, waiting for this to turn into the execution he knew was coming. But Bumpy just stood there, hands at his sides, face showing nothing. No rage, no disgust. Just the cold, empty stare of a man looking at something that used to be human and was now just a problem that needed solving. "You do not get to talk," Bumpy said quietly. "You do not get to explain. You do not get to make deals or beg for forgiveness. You just listen." Frank nodded, his throat working like he was trying to swallow glass. "You are going to stay in this room for 3 days," Bumpy continued. "You are not going to call anyone. You are not going to leave. You are not going to do anything except sit here and think about what you did and what it costs." Bumpy eye. The second slap was harder than the first, snapping Frank's head the other direction, splitting his lip open, so blood ran down his chin and dripped onto his wrinkled shirt. This time he went down his legs, giving out, dropping to his knees on the cigarette-burned carpet. "I said you do not talk," Bumpy said, his voice never rising above conversation level. 3 days. After that, we will discuss what happens next. But right now, you are going to sit in this room and understand that you are alive, because I decided you should be, and that decision can change any second I want it to. Frank stayed on his knees, blood and spit hanging from his mouth, his whole body shaking. Not from the slaps. From the understanding that Bumpy could have killed him and chose not to, which meant the punishment was going to be worse than death. Bumpy walked to the door, opened it, paused with one hand on the frame. "There are men outside watching this building. If you leave, they will call me, and then I will stop being patient." He left Frank bleeding on the floor and walked back down to his car, where his 3 enforcers sat waiting for the order to go upstairs and finish the job. Instead, Bumpy told them to set up surveillance shifts 8 hours each, rotating around the clock. No contact with Frank. Just watch. Make sure he stays put. "We are not killing him," one of them asked, confused. "Not yet," Bumpy said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Death is easy. Death is mercy. What Frank needs is to sit with what he did until it eats him alive from the inside." The official record would never mention this confrontation. No police report, no arrest, no documented evidence that Bumpy Johnson tracked down Frank Lucas and left him alive in a motel room in Yonkers. Because some punishments happen outside the law in spaces where men handle their own justice, according to rules that do not get written down. Letting someone live when they deserve to die is sometimes crueler than putting a bullet in their brain, because death ends the suffering. Life forces you to carry it forward day after day, knowing what you did, and knowing you got away with it, and knowing that getting away with it means you have to keep living with yourself. And for some men, that is a fate worse than any grave. September 18th, 1967. 3 a.m. Bumpy Johnson walked through the front doors of the 28th Precinct on West 126th Street, holding Emily Harrison's hand, and every cop in the building pulled their gun. He did not run, did not hide, did not drop the girl at the corner and disappear into the night like any sane criminal would have done. He walked straight through the doors into the fluorescent light and cigarette smoke of the precinct lobby, his shoes clicking on the tile floor, Emily wrapped in his jacket beside him, shaking but walking on her own 2 feet. The desk sergeant, a thick-necked Irish cop named O'Brien who had been taking bribes from Harlem, numbers runners for 15 years, looked up from his paperwork and froze like someone had hit pause on a movie. His hand went to the service revolver on his hip, not drawing it yet, just touching it, his brain trying to process what his eyes were seeing. Bumpy Johnson, known criminal, known associate of organized crime figures, known enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, back when she ran the numbers before the Italians moved in. Standing in a police station at 3 in the morning, holding a little white girl who looked like she had been dragged through hell and barely made it back. "Nobody move," O'Brien said, his voice cracking halfway through. He stood slowly, his hand still on his gun, his eyes locked on Bumpy. "Sir, I need you to let go of the girl and put your hands where I can see them." Bumpy did not let go, did not raise his hands, did not comply with the order in any way that made sense to a cop trained to expect fear and obedience from black men in police stations. He just stood there calm as Sunday morning, waiting for O'Brien to catch up to reality. Within 30 seconds, 6 more cops flooded into the lobby from the back rooms, guns drawn, safeties off barrels, pointed at Bumpy's chest and head and center mass. No unified commands, no coordinated response, just a dozen voices shouting contradictory orders all at once. "Hands up, let go of the girl, get on the ground, do not move." The contradictions would have been funny if there were not enough firepower in the room to kill Bumpy 17 times over. He stood perfectly still, his right hand holding Emily's left hand, his face showing nothing. No fear, no anger, no defiance. just the calm of a man who had made his decision and was willing to live or die based on how the next 60 seconds played out. Emily was crying now, soft hitching sobs that shook her whole body. Her free hand gripped Bumpy's jacket so hard her knuckles went white. She looked at the cops and their guns and started shaking worse, her breath coming in gasps like she was drowning. "Somebody call downtown," O'Brien said, his voice steadier now but still tight. "Tell them we have a possible kidnapping suspect and a victim. Get detectives down here now." One of the younger cops, a kid who looked fresh out of the academy with smooth cheeks and scared eyes, moved toward Emily like he was going to pull her away from Bumpy. That was when she screamed, "No, do not touch me. He saved me. He saved me." Her voice cracked the silence like a hammer through glass. Every cop in the room stopped moving, stopped shouting, stopped doing anything except staring at this little girl defending the man they were about to arrest for kidnapping her. "He found me," Emily sobbed, her words running together. "He got me out. He brought me here. Please do not hurt him, please." The guns did not lower immediately. Cops do not lower guns just because a victim says to. Cops lower guns when they understand the situation is not what they thought it was, and that understanding takes time to filter through adrenaline and training, and years of seeing black men as threats first and people second. But slowly, one by one, the barrels dropped. Not holstered. Just pointed at the floor, instead of at Bumpy's vital organs. O'Brien kept his hand on his revolver, but did not draw it. The room stayed tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap back into violence if Bumpy made any move that looked wrong. "Sir," O'Brien said carefully, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Slowly. Bumpy's voice came out level and clear, no strain, no fear. "I found this girl chained in a basement on West 138th Street approximately 4 hours ago. I brought her here so she could go home to her family. That is all you need to know right now." "Whose basement?" O'Brien asked. "That is a conversation for detectives, not beat cops," Bumpy said, "but I will cooperate fully." The official record would later note that suspect cooperated without resistance, which was technically true but missed the entire point. Bumpy Johnson did not cooperate because he was scared of the police. He cooperated because cooperation was the only move that kept Harlem from burning and kept Emily Harrison from becoming a statistic. Real power is not fighting when you can win. Real power is standing perfectly still while a dozen guns point at your chest and trusting that the world will recognize the difference between a criminal and a man doing what needed to be done. O'Brien holstered his weapon and gestured to one of the female officers standing near the back. "Get her some water, call her parents, and somebody get me a detective down here right now." Bumpy let go of Emily's hand, slowly, carefully, like he was releasing something fragile that might shatter if he moved too fast. She did not want to let go her fingers clinging to his for one more second before the female officer gently pulled her away, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and leading her to a chair. Emily looked back at Bumpy one more time, her blue eyes huge and wet with tears, and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Then they put handcuffs on Bumpy Johnson and led him to an interrogation room where he would sit for the next 6 hours, answering questions he mostly refused to answer, protecting people who did not deserve protection, and taking responsibility for a crime he prevented instead of committed. Because that is what you do when you understand that sometimes the truth makes things worse. Sometimes silence saves more lives than testimony. Sometimes you walk into the guns knowing they might go off because the alternative is letting an entire community pay for one man's sin. Real power is standing still when everything in your body screams to run. Real power is letting them cuff you when you could fight. Real power is trusting that history will understand what you did, even if justice never does. Interrogation room 3 smelled like stale coffee and the sweat of 1,000 guilty men who sat in that chair before Bumpy Johnson and told lies that everybody knew were lies, but nobody could prove. The cuffs bit into his wrists, standard issue steel with worn edges that had rubbed against too many wrists to count. Detective Raymond Miller sat across the metal table, a 20-year veteran with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had stopped believing anything anyone told him sometime around 1953. His partner, a younger detective named Kowalski, leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed, watching Bumpy like he was a snake that might strike if they looked away. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Miller said, his voice flat and tired. "You just happened to be walking past Frank Lucas' townhouse at midnight. You just happened to notice something wrong. You just happened to break in. You just happened to find a kidnapped child in the basement, and you just happened to bring her straight here instead of calling it in like any law-abiding citizen would do." Bumpy sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his face empty of everything except patience. "That is correct. That is the biggest load of horse shit I have heard all year," Miller said, "and I once had a guy tell me he accidentally fell on a knife 14 times while cooking dinner." "Nevertheless," Bumpy said, "that is what happened." Miller leaned forward, his elbows on the table, getting close enough that Bumpy could smell the whiskey on his breath from the flask he kept in his desk drawer. "Here is what I think happened. I think you and Frank Lucas had some kind of dispute. I think this was your way of settling it. I think you knew exactly where that girl was because you were part of the whole operation from the start." "Think whatever you want," Bumpy said. "I found a child who needed help. I brought her to the police. If that makes me guilty of something, then charge me." Kowalski pushed off from the wall, his voice younger and sharper than Miller's. "Who else knew about this? Who helped you? Give us names, and maybe we can work something out." Bumpy turned his head slowly, looking at Kowalski, with eyes that had seen better men than him break under pressure, and worse men than him die screaming. "I work alone." "Nobody works alone," Miller said. "Not in Harlem. Not in your line of business. You have people. You have connections. You have a whole network of criminals who would sell their mothers for the right price. So start talking, or I will make sure you never see daylight again." Bumpy said nothing. Just sat there, breathing slow and steady, his heartbeat never rising above, resting his face showing the same expression a stone statue shows. Because he understood something these detectives did not. Every word he spoke was a potential weapon that could be used against Harlem. Every name he gave was another family that would get raided, another business that would get shut down, another life that would get destroyed in the federal government's hunt for someone to blame. If Bumpy told them Frank Lucas kidnapped Judge Harrison's daughter, the feds would not stop at Frank. They would tear through everyone Frank ever knew, everyone Frank ever did business with, everyone who lived on the same block or drank at the same bar or bought product from the same suppliers. They would build conspiracy cases and RICO charges and drag 50 people into courtrooms on charges that might not stick but would ruin their lives anyway. And when they were done with Frank's people, they would start on Bumpy's people. Because that is how investigations work. They spread like cancer, consuming everything in reach until there is nothing left but arrests and plea deals and families torn apart. One confession, one name, one moment of cooperation, and Harlem would explode into riots and federal raids that would make 1964 look like a church picnic. Bumpy had lived through the riots. He had seen what happens when the community decides the police are the enemy, and the only response is violence. Buildings burned. People died. Children got caught in crossfire. And when the smoke cleared, nothing changed except more black men went to prison, and more black families lost their fathers and brothers and sons. So Bumpy sat silent, absorbing the accusations and the threats and the promises of leniency if he just cooperated, because cooperation was a trap, and he was too old to fall for traps. The door opened at 4:17 a.m. Judge Theodore Harrison walked in looking like he had aged 10 years in the past 4 hours. His suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, his eyes red from crying or rage or both. Behind him, Emily held tight to her mother's hand, both of them escorted by two uniformed officers. Miller and Kowalski stood immediately, the interrogation forgotten, their focus shifting to the man whose daughter had been chained in a basement. Harrison did not look at them. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, sitting in handcuffs, and for 5 full seconds nobody spoke. Then Harrison turned to his daughter. "Is this the man who hurt you?" Emily's voice came out small but clear. "No, he saved me." "Are you sure?" Harrison asked, his voice shaking. "I am sure, Daddy," she said. "He found me. He carried me out. He brought me to the police. He kept me safe." Harrison's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. He turned to Miller. "Uncuff him." "Your Honor, with all respect, we are still investigating." "I said uncuff him," Harrison repeated, his voice dropping to a tone that had sent mob bosses to federal prison and ended careers of lawyers who crossed him. "Now." Miller pulled out his keys and unlocked the cuffs. They fell away from Bumpy's wrists, leaving red marks where the metal had pressed into skin. Bumpy stood slowly, rubbing his wrists, his eyes meeting Harrison's across the table. "Thank you," Harrison said quietly, "for bringing her home." Bumpy nodded once, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make this worse. The official record would show that suspect was released without charges after victim confirmed his story. The case file would be sealed within a week. The investigation into how Emily Harrison ended up in that basement would quietly close with no arrests, no indictments, no justice that looked anything like what the law promised, because sometimes the system needs a sacrifice more than it needs the truth. And sometimes the truth is the obstacle that keeps the sacrifice from being clean. So the truth gets buried, and everyone agrees to move forward pretending it never existed, because pretending is easier than admitting that justice failed and innocent people suffered, and the only reason anyone survived was because one man chose silence over salvation. September 25th, 1967. Harlem woke up breathing again. The cars came back. The Cadillacs rolling slow down Lenox Avenue with music playing and chrome gleaming. The corner boys returned to their posts, laughing too loud, flashing money, playing dice on the sidewalk. The numbers runners went back to work, collecting nickels and dimes from housewives betting on their lucky numbers. Small's Paradise opened its doors at 6 p.m. and stayed packed until sunrise. The barbershops filled with gossip and arguments about the Yankees and debates about whether Muhammad Ali could beat Joe Frazier. On the surface, everything looked normal, but surfaces lie, and anyone who understood how power worked in Harlem knew that something fundamental had shifted beneath the streets. Frank Lucas was back. He walked into Red Rooster on Thursday night, wearing a new suit, $3,000 of Italian wool, tailored to fit him like paint, his shoes polished bright enough to see your face in the leather. He bought drinks for the bar, tipped the waitresses. $50 bills laughed at jokes that were not funny. He acted like nothing happened, like he had not crossed the one line that separated criminals from monsters, like he had not put a loaded gun to Harlem's head and almost pulled the trigger. But everyone in that bar knew. The bartender knew. The men playing pool in the back room knew. The women dancing near the jukebox knew. They knew because Harlem has no secrets, only information that travels at different speeds. And by the time Frank Lucas walked back into public view, every person who mattered had heard what he did and understood what it meant. You do not kidnap a federal judge's daughter. You do not chain a child in your basement. You do not risk destroying an entire community to save yourself. These were not laws written in books. They were rules written in blood and history and the collective understanding that some boundaries exist for reasons deeper than profit or power. Frank had crossed that boundary, and crossing it meant he was no longer one of them. He was something else now, something isolated, something people did business with because they had to, not because they trusted him. Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue watching the street below, smoking Pall Malls, and keeping notes in the black leather notebook he had carried for 30 years. He tracked Frank's movements, which bars he visited, which women he talked to, which business deals he tried to make, who still took his calls and who suddenly had other obligations when Frank came around. The isolation was surgical, not announced, not enforced with violence. Just a slow, quiet withdrawal of trust that happened one conversation at a time. A dealer who used to give Frank good prices suddenly raised them. A cop who used to look the other way suddenly started paying attention. A connection in the Bronx who used to move product stopped returning calls. Frank was still operating, still making money, still alive. But the network that protected him, the web of relationships that kept any criminal safe in a world where the law wanted you dead or in prison, was fraying thread by thread. Bumpy did not order this, did not threaten anyone, did not tell people to cut Frank off. He just let the word spread. Naturally, let people draw their own conclusions. Let the community regulate itself the way communities do, when someone violates the social contract badly enough that punishment becomes inevitable. 3 men came to Bumpy's apartment over the course of 2 weeks, asking permission to kill Frank Lucas. Men who had daughters. Men who understood what it meant to chain a child and what kind of response that deserved. Bumpy told all 3 the same thing. Not yet. Watch him. Track him. Let me know everywhere he goes and everyone he talks to. But do not touch him until I say. Because killing Frank would have been easy. A bullet in the back of the head. A car bomb. A knife in the ribs outside a nightclub. Easy, quick, final. But easy did not serve the purpose Bumpy needed served. Easy did not teach the lesson that needed teaching. Easy did not send the message to every young criminal coming up in Harlem that some lines you do not cross no matter how desperate you get. Frank Lucas was more valuable alive and isolated than dead and martyred. Alive, he served as a walking reminder of what happens when you forget the rules. Alive, he suffered every day, knowing that nobody trusted him, nobody respected him, nobody would help him when the feds finally came knocking. And the feds would come. They always did. It was just a matter of time. The official record would show that Frank Lucas continued operating in Harlem for several more years, building his heroin empire, making millions, living like royalty. And that record was accurate as far as it went. But it missed the part that mattered. It missed the fact that Frank operated alone in a business where being alone meant you were already dead, you just had not stopped breathing yet. Some men do not get eliminated because they lose. They get eliminated because nobody trusts them anymore, and once trust is gone, power follows. Then money, then freedom, then life. It just takes longer than a bullet, and the suffering stretches out across years instead of seconds. Bumpy closed his notebook and stubbed out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. Outside his window, Harlem looked peaceful. Music drifting up from the streets, laughter from the bar on the corner, cars passing slow under the streetlights. Order restored, but order built on silence and broken trust was not the same as order built on respect and fear balanced in equal measure. This was order held together with duct tape and prayer, fragile enough that one wrong move could shatter it completely. And somewhere in that fragile order, Frank Lucas walked free, alive, wealthy, and more alone than any man who still had a heartbeat. The law that governs the underworld is not written in courtrooms or statute books. It is written in consequences and memory, and the understanding that certain actions carry prices no amount of money can ever repay. Touch a child, and you erase yourself from the only protection that keeps you alive, not immediately. Not with violence that makes headlines and brings federal attention, but slowly, methodically, with the precision of a surgeon, removing a tumor one cell at a time until nothing remains but scar tissue and the memory of what used to be there. Frank Lucas lived. That fact appeared in every history book and documentary and Hollywood movie made about Harlem in the 1960s. He built an empire importing heroin from Southeast Asia, made millions, drove Ferraris, wore furs, lived in mansions. He operated for years before the feds finally caught him in 1975 and sent him to prison. These facts were documented, verified, indisputable. But what those histories missed was the part that mattered. Frank lived, but he lived isolated. He made money, but money could not buy back trust. He had power, but power without community is just violence waiting for someone stronger to come along and take it. He survived, but survival is not the same as thriving, and a man who survives alone in a world built on connections is already defeated, even if he does not know it yet. Bumpy Johnson never told anyone what he found in that basement, never testified, never cooperated with federal investigations that came sniffing around, looking for dirt on Frank Lucas. He kept that secret locked behind silence so thick that even people who knew him for decades could not crack it. And in keeping that secret, he kept Harlem safe from the riots and raids and federal attention that would have destroyed the community faster than any crime ever could. But silence has a cost. Keeping order requires compromises that eat away at your soul piece by piece until you wake up one morning and realize you are no longer the person you thought you were. You are something darker, something harder, something willing to let guilty men walk free if it means innocent people do not suffer. Bumpy paid that cost. He stepped deeper into the shadows, took on debts he could never repay, made choices that haunted him until the day he died in 1968, 1 year after saving Emily Harrison. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but anyone who knew him understood the truth. The heart that killed him was not the one pumping blood through his veins. It was the one that broke a little more every time he chose order over justice, silence, over truth, the community's survival over his own salvation. Frank Lucas eventually fell. Not to Bumpy's vengeance, not to street justice, but to the feds who finally built a case strong enough to stick. He went to prison, cooperated with prosecutors, turned informant, and spent the rest of his life trying to outrun a reputation that followed him like a shadow he could not shake. He died in 2019, old and forgotten by everyone except historians who wrote about him like he was some kind of criminal genius instead of a man who kidnapped a child and got lucky enough to survive the consequences. Emily Harrison grew up, went to college, became a lawyer, ironically. Never spoke publicly about what happened to her in September 1967. The file was sealed. The story buried. The truth locked away in archives that required federal clearance to access. She lived a normal life, got married, had children, died in 2003, surrounded by family who never knew the full story of the night a gangster saved her life at the cost of his own soul. Order was maintained. Not through law, not through courts, not through badges and guns and judges signing warrants. Order was maintained through choices made by men like Bumpy Johnson, who understood that sometimes you swallow poison to keep everyone else from dying. Sometimes you stay silent even when speaking would be righteous. Sometimes you let guilty men breathe because the alternative is watching your entire world burn. The unwritten law is simple. Touch a child, and you erase yourself. Not from life, but from trust, from community, from the protection that keeps criminals alive in a world designed to kill them. Frank Lucas learned that law the hard way. He lived, but living is not winning when you spend every remaining day isolated, watching your back, knowing that nobody will help you when the hammer finally drops. And the hammer always drops. It just takes its time. So here is the question that matters. If you were Bumpy Johnson standing in that basement, holding the hand of a terrified child, knowing that one word to the police would trigger riots and raids and suffering for 50,000 innocent people, what would you choose? Would you stay silent and let the guilty walk free to preserve order? Or would you speak the truth and accept that history will never understand why you made that choice, will never see you as the hero you tried to be? Will only remember you as the man who let a monster escape justice. There is no right answer. There is only the answer you can live with. And for Bumpy Johnson, the answer was silence. Strategic, deliberate, soul-crushing silence that kept Harlem breathing, but cost him everything he believed about right and wrong. That is the price of order. That is the weight of leadership. That is what it means to protect a community when the law offers no protection, and justice is a luxury you cannot afford. So what would you choose? September 18, 1967, ended with Emily Harrison safe in her father's arms, and Bumpy Johnson walking out of the precinct, a free man carrying handcuff marks on his wrists that would fade in 3 days. Frank Lucas stayed locked in that Yonkers motel room for 72 hours like Bumpy ordered, staring at walls and understanding that some mistakes you survive but never recover from. By October, Harlem looked normal again, cars rolling, money flowing, business operating. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Frank Lucas had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the only reason he was still breathing was because Bumpy Johnson decided his slow death would teach a better lesson than a fast one. The files were sealed, the story buried, the truth locked away in silence that protected a community at the cost of one man's soul. So here's my question for you. If you were Bumpy, would you have stayed silent to protect Harlem, or would you have told the truth and let the consequences burn everything down? Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you would choose. If this story hit different, smash that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow we are diving into the night. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Cotton Club, took a slap in front of 200 witnesses, and responded with silence that rewrote every rule in Harlem. Trust me, you do not want to miss that one. See you tomorrow.